The announcement did not arrive with ceremony or advance notice. There was no build-up, no reassuring briefing, no carefully softened language released hours ahead of time. Instead, it appeared abruptly, almost urgently, as though the palace itself had lost control of the clock. When Prince William and Princess Catherine stepped forward, it was immediately clear this was not a routine engagement. Their posture, their expressions, even the way they stood in relation to one another signaled something deeply wrong. This was not the monarchy presenting strength. This was a family bracing for impact. William spoke first, but his voice carried none of the practiced confidence expected of a future king. The words were measured, clearly prepared, yet the emotion behind them resisted control. He paused more than once, not for emphasis, but because composure kept slipping through his fingers. Catherine stood beside him, visibly strained, her stillness suggesting effort rather than calm. She did not scan the room or engage the cameras. Her focus remained inward, as though holding herself together required every ounce of attention she had left. What unsettled observers most was not what was said, but what was not. The statement avoided specifics, yet it was unmistakably grave. This was not framed as a temporary challenge or a minor adjustment. There was no familiar request for privacy meant to settle speculation. Instead, the language acknowledged something personal, something painful, something that had already altered the family in ways words could not fully convey. Before details were offered, the emotional weight had already answered the unspoken question. This was serious, and it was ongoing. The speed of the announcement raised immediate concern. The monarchy does not act quickly without reason. Its public communications are typically deliberate, layered and delayed until risk has been carefully assessed. For this statement to come together so rapidly suggested that silence had become more dangerous than disclosure. It implied pressure, not just from outside scrutiny, but from within the walls, meant to protect the institution from exactly this kind of exposure. In the hours that followed, the public reaction unfolded with remarkable intensity. Newsrooms abandoned scheduled programming. Analysts replayed the footage frame by frame. Social media filled the gaps left by official restraint with conjecture and fear. The prevailing sentiment was not simply sadness, but alarm. Many felt they were witnessing the beginning of a story rather than its conclusion, an opening admission rather than a full accounting. That sense of incompleteness lingered for a reason. The emotional cues told a deeper story than the statement itself. William's gaze remained fixed ahead, as though anchoring himself to something unseen. Catherine's expression reflected exhaustion that went far beyond a difficult day. This was not the fatigue of public life. It was the kind that accumulates quietly over time, born of vigilance, worry, and restraint. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere within royal residences had reportedly shifted long before the cameras were switched on. Staff movements became more controlled. Schedules were altered without explanation. Certain engagements disappeared from public calendars altogether. Where the palace once relied on predictability to project stability, it now operated with guarded urgency. For months, Catherine's reduced presence had been attributed to routine reasons. Official explanations cited rest, planning adjustments, and private obligations. At the time, these answers seemed sufficient. In retrospect, they read differently. Each cancelled appearance, each delayed engagement, now appeared as part of a pattern rather than coincidence. Observers began to reconsider moments that had once passed without comment, including William's attendance at key events alone, his public remarks shortened, his demeanor noticeably restrained. What had been happening out of view was far more consuming than anyone outside the palace understood. According to individuals familiar with internal operations, Catherine's health had become a subject of extreme sensitivity. Access to information was tightly limited. Medical appointments were arranged discreetly. Documentation was restricted to a small circle of senior aides. The goal was not only privacy, but containment. Such measures are not uncommon within royal households, but the scale and intensity suggested a situation escalating beyond manageable bounds. Even within an institution practiced at secrecy, the effort required to maintain appearances reportedly grew overwhelming. Staff were bound by strict confidentiality agreements. Communications were compartmentalized. Yet despite these precautions, concern continued to spread internally. The emotional toll extended beyond William and Catherine. Their children, normally shielded from the harshest pressures of royal life, were not immune. While public images continued to present composure and normalcy, those close to the family noted a change. Questions emerged at home that could not be answered with rehearsed reassurance. Routine required explanation. Absences required justification. Fear, once abstract, became personal. The strain reportedly became most visible in moments never intended for public awareness. At school, subtle signs of distress appeared. Counselors were consulted more frequently. Teachers noticed shifts in behavior. These were not isolated incidents, but indicators of a household under sustained pressure. The challenge facing William and Catherine was no longer solely about managing public perception. It was about protecting their children from the consequences of prolonged uncertainty. This internal conflict forced a reckoning that cut to the heart of royal identity. For generations, the monarchy has relied on restraint as a virtue. Endurance, silence, and composure have been treated as obligations rather than choices, but in this case those expectations collided with parental responsibility. The question was no longer whether they could maintain the image of stability, but whether doing so was causing harm. The decision to speak publicly was not reached lightly. Reports suggest it followed weeks of intense debate behind closed doors. Advisors urged caution. Tradition demanded patience. Yet the emotional cost of continued silence kept rising. When the announcement finally came, it was less a strategic maneuver than an admission that the existing approach had failed. Within palace walls, the effect was immediate. Long-standing confidence in the institution's ability to manage crises began to erode. Some viewed the statement as necessary honesty. Others feared it represented a dangerous breach of protocol. What united both sides was the recognition that something fundamental had shifted. The monarchy was no longer fully in control of its narrative. As public attention intensified, so did scrutiny of the timeline. Analysts revisited past events, aligning dates and absences. Patterns emerged that had previously gone unnoticed. Each connection reinforced the sense that the announcement marked only the surface of a much deeper issue. Then, quietly at first, information began circulating that would transform unease into shock. References appeared to internal assessments, to discussions not meant for public awareness. Whispers pointed toward documentation prepared in anticipation of long-term consequences. These were not personal notes or informal conversations, but structured evaluations conducted at the highest levels. The suggestion that such material existed altered the context of everything that had come before. If true, it meant the crisis extended beyond health and into the realm of institutional continuity. It implied that decisions were being considered that would reshape not just a family's future, but the monarchy itself. By the time confirmation of a leaked document began to surface, public trust had already begun to fray. The idea that plans could be drafted in secrecy while the family endured visible distress struck many as deeply unsettling. What had initially appeared as a tragic personal moment now hinted at a broader struggle between compassion and control. The leak did not arrive with spectacle, yet its impact was immediate and irreversible. What began as speculation hardened into certainty when journalists confirmed the existence of a confidential document prepared for internal circulation only. It was not emotional in tone, nor was it written with empathy in mind. Its language was procedural, clinical, and unmistakably institutional, and that was precisely what made it so disturbing. This was not a family grappling with private pain. This was an institution planning around it. The document outlined contingencies that went far beyond short-term concern. It assessed risk, viability, and long-term stability with a focus that felt detached from the human lives involved. Most alarming was the subject at the center of those assessments, not the reigning monarch, not the heir apparent, but a child, one whose future had already begun to be evaluated in terms of optics, public confidence, and structural continuity. The revelation reframed everything. The public announcement that had once seemed like an act of vulnerability now appeared in a different light. It was no longer just a moment of grief. It was a response, perhaps even a preemptive one, a line drawn before decisions made in silence could become irreversible. Inside the palace, the atmosphere reportedly changed overnight. What had been managed as a delicate situation was now recognized as a full-scale crisis. Senior figures convened urgently, not to discuss if action was needed, but how much control had already been lost. The leak suggested that discussions had taken place without the consent of those most affected. It raised uncomfortable questions about authority, consent, and the boundaries between duty and family. The emergency meeting at Balmoral was called under strict confidentiality, yet its urgency spoke volumes. Arrivals were staggered, communications restricted, and the agenda kept tightly focused. This was not a ceremonial gathering. It was a reckoning, and from the start, it was marked by absence. Catherine did not attend. Her refusal was not logistical, it was deliberate. According to those familiar with her position, she made it clear that she would not participate in any discussion that treated her child as a theoretical problem to be solved. Her decision resonated beyond the meeting room. It signaled a shift in where lines were being drawn and who was willing to step across them. William arrived with a resolve that surprised even those closest to him. Gone was the careful deference that had defined much of his public life. In its place was something sharper, more urgent. He did not enter the room as a prince, managing expectations. He entered as a parent, confronting a system that had begun to move without him. The exchanges that followed were tense and deeply personal. William questioned how discussions of succession could occur without transparency. He challenged the assumption that institutional continuity justified secrecy. He asked directly whether plans had been drafted that would alter his child's future without his knowledge. The answers, by some accounts, were evasive. Those defending the process emphasized tradition, caution, and precedent. They argued that contingency planning was not action, merely preparation. But that distinction did little to ease the sense of betrayal. Planning, in this context, carried weight. It shaped attitudes, it influenced decisions, and it happened in silence. As the meeting progressed, legal advisors were brought in. Documents were reviewed. Language was debated. The possibility of adjusting succession protocols was discussed with an unsettling calm. What struck many in the room was not just the substance of the conversation, but how normalized it had become. What should have felt unthinkable was being treated as procedural. Amid the tension, a moment cut through the formalities, a reminder that history has consequences, that silence, when mistaken for strength, can become its own form of damage. It shifted the tone, if only briefly, forcing those present to confront parallels they would rather forget. While these conversations unfolded behind closed doors, the public response was accelerating beyond control. What began as expressions of sympathy evolved into demands for accountability. Vigils appeared outside palace gates, first quietly, then in growing numbers. Candles and flowers gave way to signs and chants. The message was clear. Compassion was no longer enough. Answers were required. Media coverage intensified. Commentators who once defended restraint now questioned it. Public figures spoke openly about the cost of secrecy. The narrative shifted from protecting tradition to confronting harm. Each hour of silence from the palace amplified the sense that something was being withheld. Then came the footage, brief, unpolished, and devastating. A child overwhelmed, confused, and visibly distressed. It spread rapidly, not because it was sensational, but because it was human. In that moment, the abstract became undeniable. This was not about roles or titles. It was about children bearing the weight of decisions made far beyond their control. The reaction was swift and widespread. Sympathy hardened into resolve. Movements formed calling for reform, transparency, and a reassessment of what the monarchy demanded in exchange for service. Polls reflected a shift that could no longer be dismissed as temporary emotion. Confidence in leadership faltered. Support for change grew. Amid this upheaval, a letter emerged, long preserved, rarely discussed, and never intended for public release. Its timing was uncanny, its content disarming in its simplicity. Written by a mother who had lived the cost of silence, it spoke directly to the dilemma now facing her sons. It did not offer strategy or caution. It offered permission to speak, to choose truth, even when it disrupts. The impact was profound. Authentication removed any doubt. The public response was immediate and emotional. What had been a crisis of trust became a moment of alignment. The letter did not inflame tensions. It clarified them. It reframed the situation not as rebellion, but as continuity of values long suppressed. Inside the palace, the effect was destabilizing. Efforts to regain narrative control faltered. Attempts to contextualize the letter as historical were met with resistance. Its relevance was undeniable. It spoke to the present with startling precision. William's position solidified. He no longer framed his concerns as requests. He presented them as conditions. Transparency moving forward. Acknowledgement of harm caused by silence. A formal review of practices that prioritized image over well-being. These were not threats. They were boundaries. When opposition arose, it was met without retreat. Accusations of emotional decision-making were answered with silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of finality. Support from unexpected quarters shifted the balance. What had seemed radical began to feel necessary. The final address came without pageantry. No elaborate staging. No symbolic gestures beyond presence itself. William spoke plainly. He described nights defined by fear rather than duty. He spoke of watching the cost of restraint accumulate within his family. He rejected the idea that endurance without honesty was a virtue. The decision to step back from royal duties was framed not as withdrawal, but as protection, a refusal to allow roles to override responsibility, a statement that legacy means little if it demands harm in return. Catherine stood beside him, not as a symbol, but as a partner. Their children were not hidden. They were acknowledged. The message was unmistakable. This was not an institution speaking. It was a family reclaiming agency. The response that followed was overwhelming. Praise crossed borders. Critics softened. Allies emerged. Within the palace, resistance remained, but momentum had shifted. Silence no longer held the power it once did. The monarchy did not collapse that day, but it changed, perhaps irreversibly. The cost of silence had been exposed, and in choosing to speak, William and Catherine forced an institution built on restraint to confront a truth it could no longer